The high country of the northern Wind River Range carried a kind of silence that felt older than Scripture. In early autumn of 1833, that silence lay over the peaks like a hymn written in frost. Dawn crept slowly across the granite spires, lighting the cirques in muted rows, while long spears of shadow still clung to the timberline. Frost silvered the sage. Thin hoarfrost crackled beneath a man's moccasins, and the only sound in the world was the faint ticking of cooling rocks after a hard night's freeze. Through that high, cold quiet moved Elias Boone Hardesty, a lean man with a hunter's shoulders and a surveyor's careful eyes. His rifle rested easy in the crook of his arm, as natural to his grip as a quill to a clerk. Elias had the look of someone shaped by long trails. Weather-burned cheeks, a jawline half hidden under several weeks of dark stubble, hair tied back with a strip of otter hide, buckskin shirt patched more times than he could count, and a habit of pausing mid-stride to study the land the way other men study Scripture. He wasn't just another mountain rover chasing beaver tail and tall tales. He carried inside him something rarer, a mind trained by the journals of Jedediah Smith, by the precise art of measuring land, and by the hard-knocked wisdom of men older and fiercer than himself. His years as a surveyor's helper and trapper's apprentice had left him with the odd mixture of refinement and rugged practicality. Elias could draw a ridge line with an engineer's exactness, yet still snare a snowshoe hare with nothing but a bent willow wand and a prayer. But the reason he stood on this cold ridge, scanning the bowl of the valley below, had little to do with beaver or maps for fur companies. It had to do with something far stranger, something he had carried tucked inside his possibles bag for months. A map. A map no man believed in. It had come to him in summer, when the snows had only just shrunk back from the prom, high meadows. He had found the Ute elder along a creek choked with willow, lying half submerged, as if the water itself had been cradling him for one last hour. The man's pony grazed nearby, ribs showing. His breath came like wind through torn canvas. Elias had knelt, offered water, but the elder pushed the cup aside with shaking fingers. Instead, he pressed a bundle of buckskin to Elias's chest. The hide was older than any trade piece Elias had ever seen. Its edges were stiffened, its color darkened by years of sweat, smoke, and tallow. When the elder unrolled it with trembling hands, Elias saw strange symbols painted in red ochre and soot. Spirals, broken lines, sunbursts, zigzagging canyons. A great ridge painted the color of dried blood. No tribe Elias knew drew maps like that. The elder whispered words in Ute, voice so faint Elias had to lean close to hear. Made by the ghost walkers, the ones who came long before, the ones who dug for the sky metal and died in the Kai, white winter. He spoke of a Spanish entrada, a wandering party from the south in the 1600s, lost so far beyond their known trails that even Santa Fe's record keepers had only a rumor of them, miners who vanished into the cold lands. A few survivors, ragged and starving, had crawled back to Ute country, and before dying had traced on buckskin the path to the mountain of red stone where they had found silver that cuts like winter light. Whether the tale was truth or delirium, no man could say. But the elder pressed the map into Elias's hands as if passing a sacred burden. Minutes later, he died, leaving Elias alone with the buckskin that should not have existed. Down in the valley, laughter had met the story. Every trapper from Green River to the Bighorn had heard Spanish silver tales, and everyone dismissed them as campfire wind. Men like Jim Bridger, Hugh Glass, and the old free trappers of the Upper Missouri hard men, who believed only in what they could shoot, skin, or spend, mocked the notion of hidden Spanish mines in the northern Rockies. Spaniards didn't wander that far north, they told him. Even if they did, the mountains would have eaten them alive. And a Ute with a treasure map? That's a joke with moccasins on. But Elias was not a man easily swayed by mockery. While others drank, boasted, gambled, and bragged at the Fort Bonneville encampments, Elias studied the strange buckskin each night by firelight. He compared its painted lines with Smith's own roots, which he carried in a waterproof oilskin sleeve. He cross-checked crow-hunting corridors described by Beckworth. He traced again and again the looping trail that looked eerily similar to the Dominguez Escalante sketches he had once copied for a surveyor near Taos. Piece by piece, the impossible became plausible. One symbol on the map, a crooked mark like a split bison horn, matched the shape of a peculiar ridge Elias had seen, only once, high in the northern Wind River country. Another mark resembled the junction of two rivers that Smith had described with an unusual turn of phrase, a valley that narrows as if the mountains were set against intruders. Even the red-painted ridge on the map looked disturbingly similar to a band of iron-rich cliffs Elias remembered glimpsing years earlier, stained the color of dried blood. He did not believe in coincidence, not in the mountains. So he went, not for gold, not for silver, but for truth, for the chance to prove the world wrong. He pushed north through September chill, and when he reached the narrow, wind-twisted pass that matched the buckskin map, he understood why trappers avoided it. The place felt cursed. Jagged rock pinnacles knifed skyward. Wind tore through the corridor as if it resented any man daring to stand there. Locals called it Fool's Draw, a place where storms fell sideways and travelers vanished. Which made it perfect. Elias gathered deadfall timber, peeled saplings, layered bark over a rough frame, and built himself a cabin just stout enough to endure the coming snow. The kind of shelter trappers built when they knew they'd be staying longer than was wise. A single window cut with a handsaw, a door made from split pine slabs lashed with rawhide thongs, a stone chimney that leaned like a drunk but drew smoke well enough. He stacked firewood until it rose shoulder-high, cached jerky in rawhide sacks, and dug a snow trench on the north side to act as a windbreak. He would winter here. He would study the map until he understood its maker's last breath. By the time his chimney smoked for the first time, the sky had already changed. A gray curtain hung low over the peaks. The air grew sharp, metallic like the taste of iron before lightning strikes. Elias stepped outside and looked west. A wall of storm clouds rolled toward the pass, thick and violet, swallowing the ridges one by one. Snowflakes, the first of the season, drifted past him. He pulled the buckskin map from his possibles bag and held it against the dying light. The symbols seemed to glow, as if the cold itself awakened them. Behind him, the wind rose into a long, hollow moan. Ahead of him, winter marched down the mountains. The first storm had come, and with it, the promise that before this winter ended, Elias Boone Hardesty would learn whether the buckskin map was myth or destiny. Winter announced itself in Fool's Draw, not with a whisper, but with a blow that felt like the fist of the mountain itself. The storm that descended that first night swallowed the world, turned the pass into a white canyon of roaring wind and spinning ice. Elias Boone Hardesty listened to the gale slam against his rough cabin walls, each gust rattling the timber like some enormous beast testing the strength of its prey. The fire cracked behind him, spitting resin. Snow sifted through gaps in the roofline like powdered chalk. He knew then what the old trappers meant when they called this place cursed. By dawn, the storm had not eased. The snow lay heaped to Elias's knees, drifted in tightly packed layers along the cabin's north wall. Every breath he took steamed white and bitter in his own home. He shoveled the drift away with a split-log scoop, working until his arms trembled, only for the wind to push the snow right back again. Winter had barely begun, and already it was staking its claim, but Elias had survived harsher places. He remembered Larpenteur's accounts of traders wintering near Fort Union, how men dug trenches to escape the wind, how they burned green cottonwood when cured wood ran short, how they rationed spoons of tallow like they were coins of Spanish silver. Survival was not a question of strength so much as stubbornness, and stubbornness was something Elias had in abundance. For days he worked in methodical silence, cutting deadfall, stacking a deeper woodpile, weaving willow branches into a windbreak the way crow camps once shaped their privacy screens around lodges. He lined the cabin walls with brush and stretched canvas from an old trade tent between the rafters to catch the worst of the drifting snow. It was a crude fortress, but it was his. Each night, Elias unrolled the ancient buckskin map and studied it by the flicker of tallow light. The red ochre marks seemed to shift like embers as he traced their patterns with calloused fingertips. He compared each mark against memory. The ridgelines of the northern wind rivers, the crooked course of the tributaries feeding the Yellowstone, the steep gullies etched in the Crow winter stories he had gathered through years of listening. One symbol in particular troubled him, a spiral drawn with such precision it could not have been accidental. It reminded him of Ute stories, yet the style felt more Iberian, something akin to sketches he once saw copied from the Dominguez Escalante journal, where Spanish friars had marked sacred springs with circles. Why would Spanish miners mark a spiral deep in Crow country? And why had the Ute elder treated the map as a sacred burden rather than a treasure map? Answers were thin as the winter light. By early December, the snow stacked so high around Fool's Draw that the pass narrowed into a white tunnel. Elk trails faded. Even the wolves seemed to avoid the place. Elias trapped what he could, pine squirrels mostly, with an occasional jackrabbit and rationed jerky from his summer stores. He boiled marrow from broken bones. Nothing was wasted. One afternoon, while checking a deadfall trap near the creek, he heard a strange rasping sound, low, guttural, desperate. He turned just in time to see a wolverine, its fur matted with frost, eyes gleaming with a mad hunger born of winter's cruelty. The creature lunged, jaws snapping. Elias stumbled backward, boots slipping on ice, and swung his rifle like a club. The stock struck the beast's flank, but barely, slowed it. The wolverine barreled into him, and the two slid across the icy bank in a flurry of snow and claws. Elias grabbed its neck, muscles straining, forcing the snarling jaws away from his face. With his free hand, he fumbled for the skinning knife at his belt. The blade flashed, cutting through thick fur and sinew. The beast yelped, twisted violently, then went limp. Elias lay gasping in the snow, blood running down his forearm. It stung like fire, but he was alive. And the wolverine, aggressive, even by the standards Schultz had described in his Blackfeet accounts, became food and fur. In the mountains nothing attacked without reason. Hunger drove all things. That night, as he cleaned the wound and stitched it with a bone needle, the wind outside rose again. The cabin creaked, and snow pattered against the hides he had pinned along the interior walls for insulation. He felt suddenly small, a lone man perched in a narrow pass, guarded only by stubbornness, a knife, and a map, the world said, was nothing but a dying man's fever dream. Yet something changed after the wolverine attack. A thaw came briefly in mid-December, a day or two, when the sun peeked through the gray vault and the snow softened along the creek bed. Elias stepped outside to gather water and saw something glinting under the ice, a hard shape, half buried where the creek curved around a cluster of boulders. He knelt, chipped away at the ice with the butt of his knife, and pulled out a piece of metal, an iron spur, hand-forged, shaped in the old Spanish style. The chilled air around him seemed to still. Elias turned the spur over and over in his hand. The metal was pitted with age, rusted along the edges, but unmistakably Iberian, far older than any trader's gear. No American blacksmith shaped spurs like this. Not even the early Mexican vaqueros made them with the same slender neck and engraved rowel. His breath caught. The map had pointed him here. The symbols, once mockery in other men's mouths, had meaning. For the first time since arriving, Elias felt more than stubbornness. He felt certainty. Winter might break him. The storms might bury Fool's Draw under 10 feet of snow. He might starve, freeze, or die of infection before spring returned. But the spur in his hand was proof. Something had happened here, something Spanish, something lost. And Elias Boone Hardesty, alone in a cursed pass, was no longer following a rumor. He was following a trail. Long before Elias Boone Hardesty ever set foot in Fool's Draw, before he found the rusted Spanish spur in the thawing creek, the mountains had held another story one whispered across generations, half believed and half feared. Now, in the dim cabin lantern light, with winter pressing against the walls like a living thing, Elias began to piece it together. The old Ute elder's words echoed in his mind. Ghost walkers, sky metal, white winter. Elias replayed them each night as the storm wind crooned down the pass. And slowly a shape formed in his imagination, not myth, not rumor, but a human story buried beneath centuries of silence. He began with what he already knew. Spanish entradas into the northern Rockies were rare, almost reckless. The friars Dominguez and Escalante had ventured north in 1776, but even they never passed this deep into the Wind River country. Yet stray expeditions, miners, soldiers, fortune hunters had left faint scratches in the archives of Santa Fe. Elias had read copies of those reports years earlier when apprenticing under a Taos surveyor who prized old journals like sacred relics. Most were vague, boasting, or contradictory, but one stood out, an entry, barely a paragraph, written by a Spanish scribe who recorded a small company of miners who ventured far into the unknown north seeking metal of fine purity. Their fate was never explained. Elias now suspected he held the explanation in his hands. The buckskin map painted in, ochre and soot, its symbols unlike any tribal markings he had ever seen. Night after night he studied it, tracing the lines with the same patience Jedediah Smith once used while mapping unknown rivers. Elias compared each mark with every trail, ridge, bend, and bluff he could recall. The map was not the work of a tribal artist, nor the naive sketch of a dying wanderer. Its angles were deliberate. The distances, though not scaled, were proportionally true. Whoever painted it had intended it to guide someone back, someone who never returned. By midwinter the storms grew worse, but Elias's understanding grew sharper. He began reordering the symbols, reading them not as pictures but as instructions. One line, the long, looping trail he once thought a river, might actually be the path the lost entrada had taken as they fled the mountains. The spiral, which puzzled him before, now resembled something else entirely, a representation of a box canyon twisting inward upon itself. Then came the part that changed everything. One bitter night, with the fire guttering low and the wind scraping at the cabin like claws, Elias noticed something on the buckskin he had missed. A tiny mark at the map's edge so faint it blended with the natural grain of the hide. When he held it closer to the light, the symbol revealed itself. A sunburst. Not the broad, open sunburst used in many tribal drawings, but a narrow, spiked one nearly identical to the Spanish cartographer's mark for Solstice Point. A shiver ran down Elias's spine. If that was true, then the map was not simply a drawing of a place. It was a calendar, a guide usable only at a specific time of year. A map written by men who expected the reader to understand the sun, the shadows, the seasons. He leaned back, heart pounding. The Ute elder had said the survivors were half mad with cold when they made the map, yet something in them, discipline, training, desperation, had forced them to encode what mattered most, the location of the mine. But if the sunburst marked solstice, then the map could only be fully interpreted during the darkest days of winter now, as Fool's Draw lay smothered beneath layers of white. Between storms, Elias took short trips into the pass, studying how the sun cast shadows over the ridges. His fingers numbed, breath freezing against his scarf, he watched the mountains move with the day's turning light. He noted where the shadows formed sharp angles, where they curved, where they aligned with the strange zigzag shape on the buckskin. One angle matched perfectly a V-shaped crease between two jagged ridges that only appeared when the sun sat low in the southern sky. Elias stared at it for a long time, stunned. The map was no myth. It was a field manual. But knowledge invited trouble. Even in deep winter, Fool's Draw was not wholly empty. Word traveled fast in the mountains, and rumors faster still. Men talked in the rendezvous camps about the quiet, Hardesty fellow with the crazy Ute treasure hide. Some laughed, others shrugged, but a few men with hunger in their eyes listened too carefully. On a rare, clear morning, Elias spotted tracks crossing the far end of the pass. Not elk, not wolf. Human, 2 riders, maybe 3. He found a pipe ember, still warm, buried in the snow beside a rock. Whoever had passed through was watching the land, studying his territory. Claim jumpers, horse thieves. Outlaws of the mixed blood gangs who followed the Crow or Arapaho, not out of culture but out of opportunity. They would kill a man for a map that led nowhere. He tightened the latch on his cabin door that night, loaded both rifles, strung a rawhide tripline across the back entrance, and still, sleep came slow. On the fourth night after spotting the tracks, a faint crunch sounded outside the cabin snow, compacting under careful feet. Elias eased his rifle into his hands, breath held, eyes fixed on the door. A shadow passed across the place. Window hide, then another, then silence. Minutes dragged like hours. At last, the footsteps retreated. But not far. He knew then he was no longer wintering alone. Someone had found Fool's Draw interesting enough to linger. The mountains were not empty, and trails of old silver drew more than honest men. As the wind rose again and the snow hissed against the eaves, Elias Boone Hardesty realized something simple and terrifying. If he wanted the truth of the lost Entrada, if he wanted to find what the dying Ute elder had begged him to seek, he would have to race men who believed the map meant riches. And men who believe in silver kill far faster than winter. When the storms finally loosened their grip on Fool's Draw, the world emerged raw and sharp-edged, as though winter had stripped away anything soft or forgiving. The early February sun cast long blue shadows across the pass, revealing every hoofprint, every bent branch, every forgotten trace of those who had watched Elias from the darkness. He saw those tracks again, now older, snow-crusted, but unmistakably human. 2 sets, maybe 3. They led northward, then vanished where the wind scoured the draw down to bare stone. Whoever they were, they had been patient enough to wait out storms that sent even wolves crawling into shelter. Elias Boone Hardesty did not scare easily, but he understood the rules of the mountain. Cold might kill a man slow, but other men killed quick. And men who stalked silently through deep winter were not greenhorn gamblers from Street Lewis. These were outlaws, broken remnants of tribes, deserters from the fur brigades, men banned from rendezvous camps, and renegades who survived by taking from others. He had no intention of dying over an unproven map. So he chose speed. He chose the North Trail. And he chose to trust the only ally the winter had left him. Elias found him 3 days' travel north in a cedar grove beside the North Fork of the Shoshone. Jean-Luc was a French-Canadian free trapper with crow ties, a man with a fox's grin and a hunter's silence, lean as a willow and twice as flexible. He greeted Elias with a steaming tin cup of boiled tea and a raised eyebrow. "You look as though the winter's been gnawing on you," Jean-Luc said, stirring his pot of venison stew. "It has teeth," Elias replied, sliding the buckskin map from his possibles bag. "And I've found something that gives them reason to bite harder." Jean-Luc studied the map for a long time, turning it in his calloused hands. When he lifted his eyes, the fox grin was gone. "I've seen something like this," he murmured. "Crow elders speak of a red mountain, a place where white men once dug into the earth until it bled silver. None who went searching for it came back." "The Ute elder who gave me the map said as much," Elias answered. "He called the Spanish miners ghost walkers." Jean-Luc nodded slowly. "And if the Crow and the Ute both speak of the same thing, then perhaps your map is no jest after all." The two set out the next morning, traveling through drifts that reached their horses' bellies. They pushed along. Crow trails carved into the foothills generations earlier paths. Smith himself once followed when crossing the Absaroka. Snow weighted the branches until they bowed like old men. The wind carried the cold bite of the high ridges, sweeping down in punishing gusts that stole breath and feeling alike. But slowly the land changed. The narrow forests thinned, the foothills grew steeper, and the earth itself took on a strange, rusted hue. By the fourth day, the two men crested a broken ridge and stared down into a basin. Elias immediately recognized the blood-red ridge, a long, slanted wall of iron-rich stone stained the color of dried blood. Even in winter, the rock burned with a ruddy glow whenever the sun hit it. Elias felt his breath leave him. The mark on the buckskin painted in ochre matched this ridge exactly. They descended into the basin cautiously. The snow was thinner here, windswept and sun-hardened. Sparse pines clung to the slopes like stubborn survivors. The basin was eerily silent, and yet the air carried a tension Elias recognized from battlefields of the frontier places where death had seeped into the ground long ago. Jean-Luc's horse stopped suddenly, ears pricked forward. "Look," the Frenchman whispered. Half buried in snow lay a timber structure, crude and sagging hand-hewn logs blackened with age. Elias dismounted, brushing aside snow with his mittens. What emerged from beneath the drifts made his stomach tighten. A Spanish-style support frame, cut with narrow chisels. The remnants of a mining brace. And next to it, a rusted pickaxe head, its shape unmistakably colonial. "This is it," Elias said softly. But the ridge held more. Near the mouth of a collapsed shaft, they found splintered wood where someone had once set charges. The marks were centuries old, but deliberate evidence of a fire-quench mining technique Elias had read about in Devoto's accounts. Heat the rock until it cracks, cool it with water, break it open. The Spanish had done exactly that. Jean-Luc knelt, running a thumb over the charred remains. They were here, no doubt now. Elias turned toward the blood-colored cliffs, heart pounding with vindication. He wasn't chasing phantoms. He wasn't trapped in winter madness. The entrada had been real. The miners had dug deep into this ridge, and they had left more than tools behind. Tracks, fresh ones, cut through the snow near the shaft. Not animal, not theirs, boot tracks. 3 men, heading upslope, circling. Jean-Luc stiffened. "They found this place before us." No sooner had he spoken than a rifle cracked from the far ledge. Snow kicked up inches from Elias's boot. Another shot ricocheted off the timber brace. The horses reared, screaming. Shadows darted along the high, ridge figures moving with the speed and confidence of men who had scouted this ground already. Outlaws, claim jumpers, winter wolves in human form. Elias dove behind a boulder as another shot whined past his ear. Jean-Luc returned fire, rolling into cover. The outlaws who had stalked Fool's Draw had followed the map's trail just as he had. Only now the race had ended, and the fight had begun. As the sun dipped and shadows stretched across the blood-red stone, Elias Boone Hardesty realized the truth with a cold clarity. The map had brought him to the right place. But it had brought others too, men with hunger in their eyes, greed in their hearts, and rifles trained on the only 2 souls who stood in their way. Winter had been brutal, but men were worse. Snow slid from the overhang in a soft hiss as Elias Boone Hardesty and Jean-Luc Marceau dove behind the cover of a fallen limber pine. Another bullet snapped past, biting a splinter of bark into Jean-Luc's mater's cheek. The Frenchman wiped the blood with the back of his glove and flashed a feral grin. 3 of them, he murmured. Maybe 4. They move like men who've lived too long outside the law. Elias eased his rifle around the trunk, scanning the ridgeline. He spotted a flicker of movement, brown coat, fur fringe, the glint of a barrel, and fired. The shot rang through the basin and echoed off the blood-red cliff walls. A curse followed, then silence. "They're circling us," Elias said, "trying to flank from above." "We cannot stay in the open," Jean-Luc replied. "We need walls. Real ones." Elias looked downward into the basin, eyes narrowing. Near the collapsed Spanish shaft stood a strange shape, round, low, and half-sunken beneath winter's drifts. A ring of timber and earth. He had not noticed it before, hidden under a crust of snow. "A buffalo pound," Jean-Luc said, seeing it at the same moment. "Crow-built, older than Larpenteur's first. Trade year. A crow buffalo pound circular, with a single narrow entrance and walls built from stacked logs, branches, and earth. A trap for beasts, now abandoned. But for 2 mountain men under rifle fire, it'll do," Elias said. They sprinted downslope, snow flying in chest-high sprays. Shots cracked behind them. One slug tore through Elias's sleeve. Another grazed Jean-Luc's pack strap. They dove into the narrow gap of the buffalo pound just as a 3rd shot smashed into the log frame above their heads. Inside, the structure was dark, smelling faintly of old earth and animal musk. Snow sifted through gaps in the roof of tangled brush. but the walls, those thick walls, would stop bullets long enough for them to work. "Get that entrance blocked," Elias barked. They shoved timbers, old stones, even a rusted Spanish brace against the gap until it formed a knee-high barricade. Not impenetrable, but tight enough to hold for a time. "Now we make this place a fort," Elias said. Jean-Luc raised an eyebrow. "A fort? With what? Snow and prayers?" "With what the mountains gave us." They moved like men racing the sun. Jean-Luc reinforced the inner wall with frozen sod cut from the basin floor. Elias carved firing gaps through the timber, narrow slits just wide enough for a barrel. They dug shallow pits near the walls, ankle breakers for anyone trying to rush the entrance. Elias wove a smoke funnel from supple willow branches and wedged it into the upper wall, a trick he had learned from a Spanish blockhouse near Taos. Vented smoke would make the defenders look more numerous. When they finished, the makeshift fort looked less like an abandoned buffalo trap and more like a frontier blockhouse, the kind men built when they knew the next hour might be their last. As twilight thickened, the outlaws tested the walls. A boot crunched outside, a shadow slid past the narrow firing slit. Jean-Luc held his breath. Then nothing. Minutes passed. Then a rock clattered against the outer wall. "They're probing," Elias whispered. "Learning the shape." Jean-Luc nodded. "Riflemen, not fools. They'll wait for night." Elias unrolled the buckskin map, hands steady despite the tension. The symbols flickered in the lantern light. The spiral canyon, the red ridge, the solstice sunburst. He traced the path leading northward from the Spanish shaft. An odd, looping trail he had not yet explored. "What are you thinking?" Jean-Luc asked. "That the Spanish didn't dig only where we saw." Elias tapped the spiral mark. "They hid something, and the outlaws don't know where." Jean-Luc studied him, then nodded slowly. "You want to find it, and use it," Elias said. A thought had formed in his mind, clear and dangerous. He had found powder earlier, Spanish, old, stored in clay pots in the collapsed shaft, unstable but usable. Enough to start a landslide or cripple a ridge trail, enough to strike fear into men who believed they were the hunters, but he needed a route out of the fort. At midnight, the storm clouds parted just enough to spill moonlight across the ridge. Elias crept to the far wall and brushed aside snow until his fingers found what he had hoped for. A drainage tunnel. Narrow, half-collapsed, but passable for a desperate man. "This is madness," Jean-Luc whispered when Elias showed him. "Only if I don't come back," Elias replied. Jean-Luc clasped his forearm. "Then come back." Elias slid into the tunnel, crawling through cold mud and frozen roots until the faint glow of moonlight guided him out onto the backside of the basin. He rose silently, rifle ready, breath clouding into silver mist. The outlaw camp lay across the ridge, a faint orange glow against the snow. 3 figures huddled near a small fire. One stood watch, rifle in hand, scanning the basin. Elias circled behind them like a wolf in deep winter. He saw their gear: stolen rifles, traps, horse tack. He saw something else, too, a torn scrap of paper pinned with a knife to a saddlebag, a sketch of the buckskin map. They would not stop, not until they had killed him, not until they found the Spanish mine. Elias's jaw tightened. He crept toward the clay pots half buried in the collapsed Spanish shaft. Powder. Enough for one chance. The wind shifted. He lit the fuse with a coal taken from the outlaw fire. He slipped back into the tunnel. Then the night exploded. A thunderous roar rolled across the basin. Snow and stone avalanched down the ridge. The outlaw's cries vanished beneath the sound of the mountain falling. When Elias emerged from the tunnel inside the fort, Jean-Luc stared at him with wide eyes. "You didn't kill them all," he said softly. "No," Elias replied. "But I made certain they can't reach us before dawn." Outside, the wind carried the fading echo of the landslide. Inside, the lantern flickered. The siege was not over. But the mountain had shifted. And now Elias Boone Hardesty held the high ground. Dawn crept slowly over the blood-red ridge, pale and brittle as eggshell light. Steam drifted from the collapsed slope where Elias Boone Hardesty had set off the powder. Wisps of dust still curled upward, catching the morning sun in thin golden threads. The ridge trail the outlaws had used was gone, buried beneath tons of fractured stone and snow. The mountain had closed its fist. Jean-Luc Marceau stood atop the inner wall of the makeshift fort, rifle resting on a timber brace. His breath smoked in the cold air. 2 bodies, he murmured. Broken by the fall. The third, I do not see. Elias nodded grimly. One lived, the leader, most likely. Jean-Luc scanned the basin. He'll come back with others. Wolves gather in packs. Then we find what the Spanish left before he does. Elias slung his possibles bag over his shoulder, tucked the buckskin map safely inside his coat, and climbed out of the fort. The basin felt different in morning light, less haunted, but still holding its breath, as though waiting for what came next. They made their way toward the ridge where the avalanche had struck, careful to avoid unstable snow. To the right of the collapse, partly sheltered by a natural overhang, stood a narrow ravine Elias had glimpsed only briefly the day before, now revealed in full by the shifting snow. It twisted inward like a spiral. Exactly like the mark on the buckskin map, Jean-Luc ran a hand along the stone. The Ute elder spoke truth. This canyon, it was hidden. Winter is the only season that reveals the entrance. Elias's pulse quickened. He stepped inside. The ravine walls rose sharply, glowing faintly red with iron oxide. Ahead, the passage narrowed until it formed a natural choke point, almost perfectly aligned with the solstice sunburst symbol. Snow lay untouched here, a smooth white carpet leading deeper into the earth. They followed it 50 paces, before the ravine opened into a bowl of stone, and there, carved into the cliffside, was the unmistakable shape of a mining entrance. Framed in hand-cut timbers, blackened by old fires, collapsed but not entirely sealed. Elias knelt by the entrance, brushing away ice from the rock. Tool marks, hundreds of them. Spanish chiseling, narrow, angled, precise. Jean-Luc exhaled softly. By the bones of the old voyageurs. The lost entrada, Elias whispered. They were here. They worked in silence, using a pry bar and gloved hands to clear the collapsed entrance. The timbers groaned, half frozen and brittle with age. At last, a dark gap appeared wide enough for a man to crawl through. Elias lit a twist of pine pitch and slid inside. The air was cold but not deadly, circulating through old shafts and cracks. The tunnel stretched 10 paces before widening into a hollow chamber. On the floor lay fragments of history, rusted shovel blades, stone hammers with rawhide, bindings, remnants of clay pots that once held powder. But what drew Elias's eye was the pile of dark stone against the far wall. He picked up a heavy chunk and tilted it toward the flame. Silver ore, rich, glittering veins running like threads of moonlight through the rock. The Spanish miners had found what they sought. Jean-Luc entered behind him, ducking low. "Is it?" "It is." Elias handed him the ore. Not gold, silver, enough to make men kill for centuries. Jean-Luc studied the chunk with a mix of awe and dread. No wonder the survivors made a map. Elias nodded. But they also hid it. They didn't want others to find what destroyed them. Before they could speak further, a faint crunch echoed from the ravine outside. Elias killed the flame instantly. Darkness swallowed them whole. Jean-Luc's breath brushed his ear. Footsteps? Careful ones. They listened. Another crunch. Then a low scrape, the unmistakable sound of someone climbing over frozen rock. The outlaw who survived. He had followed their trail. Elias motioned for Jean-Luc to stay low. They eased toward the tunnel entrance, but before Elias could peer out, a shadow moved against the light, a man crouching with a rifle, muzzle first. Elias shoved Jean-Luc aside. A shot blasted into the chamber, ricocheting sparks from the stone wall. The survivor snarled, "Hardesty!" his voice raw with cold and rage. Elias recognized him now. A man known on the frontier as Tallow Jack, a killer turned horse thief, mixed blood and merciless, a ghost of the Rockies. He must have crawled from the avalanche before the snow settled. Tallow Jack fired again, bullets carving dust into Elias's eyes. "No talking today, Hardesty," he shouted. "Just dying." Elias reached behind him, his fingers brushing something smooth and round. A clay powder pot, intact. He met Jean-Luc's eyes. The Frenchman understood instantly. Elias rolled the pot toward the entrance. Jean-Luc fired at it. The pot exploded in a deafening flash. The tunnel shook, showering dust and splinters. The blast flung Tallow Jack backward out of sight. Elias and Jean-Luc crawled out after the smoke cleared. At the ravine floor lay Tallow Jack alive, barely, one leg pinned under fallen stone. His rifle lay yards away, twisted from the blast. He glared at Elias with hatred and envy intertwined. "You found it." Elias stared down at him, chest heaving. "Yes, and that's exactly why no man should own it." For a moment the outlaw's defiance flickered. Then Winter swallowed his last breath. Jean-Luc exhaled shakily. "What now, mon ami?" Elias looked toward the mine entrance, toward the silver that had killed Spaniards, Ute, and outlaws alike. The truth came to him as clearly as wind across an open ridge. "We bury it," he said. "All of it." Jean-Luc nodded. "A secret between us and the mountains." They spent the rest of the day collapsing the turned entrance, using old timbers and the weakened roof to seal it completely. Snow began to fall again, thick and quiet, covering the tracks, the blast marks, the blood, the footprints, everything. By dusk, the ravine looked untouched, as if no human hand had ever carved into it. Elias stood at the entrance, breathing deep. The Spanish mine had been found. And now, by their choice, it would be lost again. Hidden from greed, hidden from ruin, hidden for good. Winter closed around the mountains, and the wind carried away all trace of what had happened there, leaving only the memory in two living men. When the last snowdrift slid down over the sealed ravine, Elias Boone Hardesty felt something inside him settle, a weight lifted, a circle closed. He stood in the quiet of the basin, the blood-red ridge glowing faintly through the snowfall, and listened to the wind scour the cliffs clean of footprints and memory. It almost felt as if the mountain itself approved of the burial. Jean-Luc. Marceau came to stand beside him, stamping snow from his moccasins. "It is done," he said softly. "The mind sleeps again." "Let it sleep," Elias replied. For a long moment the two men watched winter erase the visible world. Snow softened the sharp edges of stone. Drifts filled the tracks of men and horses. The wind carried a thin whisper through the dead pines, a sound that might have been mourning or gratitude. Elias wasn't sure. They returned to the makeshift fort only long enough to gather their gear and salvage what could be saved. The buffalo pound walls had held through the siege, but the roof sagged, half burned from the explosion's echoing heat. Jean-Luc kicked aside melted snow, clearing a path to their supplies. Elias retrieved the buckskin map from its oilskin sleeve, carefully rolling the ancient hide so no moisture touched it. "What will you do with it?" Jean-Luc asked. Elias studied the painted lines, spirals, ridges, the red ochre cliff symbol that had led them to the truth. "What the Spaniards failed to do," he murmured. "Give it rest." He tucked the map into his coat, close to the warmth of his chest. They broke camp at sunrise the next day, leaving the cursed basin behind. As they ascended the northern slope, Elias cast one last look over his shoulder. The blood-red ridge stood solemn and cold, its secret returned to the earth. No sign of Spanish tools, outlaws, or the miners' last desperate efforts, remained only stone and winter wind. Jean-Luc rode ahead, choosing a route that threaded through frozen meadows and wind-scoured ridges. The mountains were quiet, almost reverent. Even the wolves kept their distance. Perhaps they, too, sensed the closing of an old wound. They traveled south until Fool's Draw came into view, the small cabin hunched beneath its drifted roof like a creature weathering its final season. Elias dismounted and walked the perimeter slowly, brushing snow from the walls and retrieving the stores he had left behind. Jean-Luc watched him with a half-smile. "You built a stronghold here, a foolish man's cabin, in a fool's pass, yet it saved your life." Elias chuckled. "Every man needs a stretch of land that others are too smart to bother with." When the last pack was secured, they mounted again and began the long descent toward lower country. Winter loosened its grip the farther they rode. By the time they reached the foothills, the snow lay thinner, interrupted by sagebrush and the first brown grasses of late winter. They camped beneath a limestone overhang, fire crackling warm between them. Jean-Luc roasted a strip of venison while Elias stared into the flames, mind drifting over the last months. The Ute elder's dying gift, the storm and fool's draw, the Spanish spur in the thaw, the siege, the mine, and the outlaw who would never ride again. Jean-Luc broke the silence. "Will you tell the crow what we found?" "No," Elias said, shaking his head. "Better they never know how close greed came to touching their hunting grounds again." Jean-Luc nodded. "Crow stories say some mountains are better left alone, and this one more than most," Elias agreed. The map weighed softly in his coat. Not in burden, only in responsibility. When spring finally touched the land, the two men parted ways. Jean-Luc rode north, toward the Crow villages near the Bighorn, where he had kin by adoption and a woman who waited whenever the mountains released him. He clasped Elias's arm with a warrior's grip. "Do not return to that ridge," he said firmly. "Let the dead sleep." "I will," Elias promised. Jean-Luc gave him a knowing smirk. "But you will go somewhere. Men like you cannot sit by a quiet fire long." With a shout of parting, the Frenchman rode off across the thawed meadows, disappearing into the shimmering distance. Elias turned south toward Taos, traveling alone once more. The trail unwound before him across rolling foothills, river bottoms, and sage flats. He moved like a man, half in the present and half in the memory of what he had witnessed, a Spanish dream buried for centuries, rediscovered, and then put to rest again by his own hand. He crossed into New Mexico by mid-spring, arriving at the outskirts of Taos with dust on his boots and a story no sane man would believe. The traders, trappers, and muleteers greeted him with nods and jokes, unaware that the quiet man in buckskin carried the last link to a lost entrada. Elias found a small room to rent above a cooper's shop. There, by lamplight, he unrolled the buckskin map one final time. He studied it not as treasure, nor as a map to riches, but as a fragment of history, one preserved through blood, frost, and desperation. Then he took a sheet of fresh paper and drew a precise copy with a surveyor's hand. Every ridge, every mark, every symbol captured clearly. He folded the original map and sealed it inside an oiled leather packet. The copy he placed in a cedar box. One he kept, the other he locked away, not for profit, not for gain, but for remembrance. One day, perhaps, a historian or friar or archivist might open that cedar box and wonder at the strange union of Spanish symbols and frontier geography. They might call Elias Boone Hardesty a fool or a liar or a misguided wanderer. But truth has a way of surviving in quiet corners. Years later, men would whisper about a lone frontiersman who built a fort no outlaw could breach, who braved winter storms and greed-blinded killers, and who uncovered a lost Spanish mine only to bury it again. Some said the map was a myth, others said the story was campfire wind. But the mountains remembered, and the buckskin map, locked away in its cedar chest, remembered too. Its symbols, solstice, spiral, ridge, and ravine, waited quietly in the dark, patient as stone, holding the truth of the lost entrada, until someone worthy might read it again.